I took that job because I wanted a kind of quiet I thought I understood. At the time, I was 38, recently divorced, and more tired of people than I was willing to admit out loud. For almost 15 years, I had worked in communications maintenance in one form or another. Microwave links, rooftop dishes, rural repeater boxes, leased band equipment, anything that sat in weather and needed someone dependable to keep it from embarrassing the company that owned it. It was honest work. I liked bolts and seals and voltage checks. I liked things that told you what was wrong if you listened carefully enough. What I didn't like, by the end, was the rest of it. Too much travel. Too many hotel rooms with floral bedspreads and broken ice machines. Too many supervisors who understood spreadsheets better than wind load. My marriage had been damaged less by drama than by absence. I was gone too often, home too briefly, and by the time my wife and I finally sat across from each other at our kitchen table and spoke plainly, we were both already speaking like visitors. After that, I spent about 6 months taking short contracts nobody else wanted. Solar tower maintenance outside Tucson, amateur observatory repair near Alamogordo, a string of weather station retrofits for a county that never quite paid on time. Then, through a man I knew in El Paso who knew another man in Albuquerque, I heard about the relay. The job description was brief enough to be almost suspicious. A private land trust had inherited an old satellite ground site on a mesa outside a small New Mexico town. The place had once belonged to a federal communications program, then a defense contractor, then nobody useful for a while. The trust wasn't using it, couldn't fully demolish it because of environmental review, and needed somebody on site to keep it secure, keep the weather out, and stop the remaining systems from decaying into a liability. Housing included. Monthly stipend, fuel allowance, very little oversight. It sounded, in other words, like a place where nobody would ask me to attend meetings. I drove up in late September. The town was called San Luis de la Mesa, though most of the highway signs shortened it to San Luis, and most of the people who lived there just called it the town. It sat low in a basin of tan earth and pale grass with the mesa behind it, and long blue ridges farther off to the west. There were cottonwoods near the dry wash, a school, a church with a bell that ran slow in winter, 2 gas pumps, a feed store, a post office, a diner called The Junction, and a collection of houses that looked as if they had learned over decades how much of themselves to offer the sun. The relay was 3 miles above town by a paved county road that turned to patched blacktop and then to a rougher private spur behind a locked gate. It came into view all at once after the last rise. 2 dishes, both bigger than they had looked from below, stood inside a square of chain-link fence on the flattened top of the mesa. One was the main dish, broad and pale and weathered into a sort of dull bone color, with its support truss running back to a thick concrete base. The second was smaller, offset to the east, tilted at a slightly different angle, its paint flaking where years of dry wind had taken hold. Below them sat the operations building, a cinder block structure with a steel roof, a machine room, a narrow control room still lined with old racks, and a side office with a desk that had outlived its reasons. Off to one side stood a diesel generator shed, and a trailer that would be mine if I wanted the job. I knew before I finished unloading that I would take it. The place was sun-faded, practical, and tired in a way I recognized. The dishes still had dignity. That sounds sentimental, but equipment that was built well tends to keep a certain posture, even after usefulness has moved elsewhere. The main dish held itself against the sky, like it still expected a schedule. The trailer was better than I had feared. Not comfortable in any generous sense, but sound. A bed against one wall, a little kitchen with a fridge that hummed too loudly, a table by the window, an evaporative cooler, a shower that took patience, and metal cupboards somebody had lined with shelf paper sometime in the 90s. There was even a porch light, though the bulb flickered when the wind shifted. The man who met me there was named Pete Alvarado. Pete had been keeping half an eye on the site for the land trust for a little over a year. He was 60-something, narrow-faced, sun-browned, and slow in the efficient way men become slow after decades of having no need to prove they can hurry. Before that, he had done road maintenance for the county and some electrical work around the irrigation district. He knew everybody in town and most of their grandparents by the sound of a truck coming up the grade. He showed me the diesel tank, the breaker room, the padlocks, the logbooks, the rainwater cistern I wasn't meant to drink from unless I had to, and the fenced gravel strip where pack rats liked to gather under the generator lines if you let them get comfortable. Then he showed me the rules. They were typed on a yellowing sheet in a plastic sleeve tucked into the top drawer of the control room desk. 6 of them. No logo, no official heading, just 6 lines and date stamps so faded I couldn't make out the year. Pete handed me the sleeve and said, "Read those now, then read them again tonight." I leaned against the desk and read. 1. The relay should not activate before 10:14 p.m. If it does, stay outside the fence until the smaller dish completes its first turn. 2. During activation, never let both dishes face the town at the same time. If they begin to track south together, kill the west motor at breaker C. 3. Keep the machine room dark for the first 11 minutes. If activation continues past that, switch on every interior light and remain inside until the motors stop. 4. If the houses below look darker than usual, call the junction diner before touching the controls. 5. Do not use a radio, cell phone, or camera while the relay is moving. 6. If the town appears completely dark, leave by the east road and do not drive through Main Street until sunrise. I looked up from the paper. "Those for weather?" I asked. Pete shook his head once. "What are they for, then?" He took the sheet back, slid it into the drawer, and closed it with more care than seemed necessary. "For when it activates," he said. That was my introduction. No story, no warning speech, no grin to let me know he was having fun with the new man. Just a statement delivered in the same tone he'd used for the fuel gauge and the spare filters. I should say here that the relay was supposed to be dead. That was the official position, anyway. The mains that had once fed the transmitting systems had been disconnected years earlier. Most of the racks in the control room were empty shells. The old cryogenic cooling line had long since been removed. The uplink equipment was gone. Half the indicator panels no longer did anything when touched. The trust only kept a low service line to the site, enough for security lights, the trailer, and minimal environmental controls in the machine room, so the remaining gear wouldn't rot into an insurance problem. On paper, I wasn't there to operate anything. I was there to maintain an abandoned site until lawyers and environmental paperwork decided what abandoned was allowed to mean. That first week settled around me in the dry, slow way life does in places with a lot of sky. I woke early because the sun on the trailer wall made sleeping late feel like carelessness. The mornings were clear and cool, the air smelling faintly of sage and dust before heat got to it. I'd make coffee in the little dented percolator Pete had left behind, stand on the trailer step, and look down at the town while the light moved across the basin. You could see who got up first. The school buses, the feed truck, the smoke from one chimney in winter, the water tower painted white and blue, catching sun before the houses did. Then I'd work. My duties were simple enough on paper. Check fence integrity. Grease the azimuth ring on the main dish once a week. Keep the building sealed. monitor the battery backups, run the generator under load twice a month, sweep pack rat nests out of the conduit channels, replace roof sealant where the sun broke it down, drain condensation from the old waveguide trunks, even though there was nothing left in them to speak of. Make sure nobody had come up from town to drink beer under the dishes and carve initials into equipment worth more than their truck. I liked the routine. In the afternoon, I usually drove down to town for supplies or lunch. The Junction Diner sat on the corner opposite the gas pumps, a low building with a green roof, a pie case near the register, and a bell above the door that always sounded slightly late. The same woman worked the counter most days. Her name was Marisol Vega, and she had the kind of face that could look tired and alert at the same time. She was probably in her mid-30s then, maybe a little younger than me, with dark hair pinned up while she worked, and a voice that stayed level even when the lunch crowd from the county yard came in all at once. She knew, by my second visit, where I was staying. "That old hill place?" she said, pouring coffee. "Yeah." She glanced toward the windows, meaning the mesa. "You there full-time?" "That's the idea." She nodded, but in a way that suggested the idea belonged to someone else. People in town did not ask many direct questions about the relay. That took me a little time to notice, because at first it felt like ordinary courtesy. Small towns often know when not to pry. But after a while, I realized it was more specific than that. If I talked about the water tank, or the trailer plumbing, or the wind on the mesa, everyone had opinions. If I mentioned the dishes, conversation tended to slide gently away. Not in fear, exactly, but in the manner of people long used to a subject that no longer repays speculation. Pete came by the site every few days for the first month. He showed me where the old manuals were kept in a mildew-resistant cabinet. He explained the generator's bad habits. He walked me through the breaker panel more than once, tapping labels with one blunt finger. He also, without making a ceremony of it, began orienting me to the rule nights. That was what he called them. Not activation nights, not test cycles, just rule nights. "They don't happen regular enough to be a schedule," he said one evening while we stood by the fence watching the light go out over town. "But regular enough that you stop treating them as surprise." "How often?" He shrugged. "Some months twice, sometimes not for weeks. Weather seems to matter, but not in a clean way. And it actually activates. Enough to call it that." I waited for more. Pete leaned one forearm on the fence post. "You'll hear the small dish first when it goes. Not loud. More like an old refrigerator waking up." That image stayed with me. The first time I heard it, I knew exactly what he meant. It was a Thursday, warm for October, with a dry wind that had eased just after sunset and left the whole mesa unusually still. I had eaten down at the diner, come back up with a slice of pie wrapped in foil, written up the day's maintenance notes, and settled into the trailer with a paperback I wasn't really reading. Around 10, the porch light outside flickered once and steadied. Nothing remarkable in that. The service line did that sometimes. Then, at 10:23 by the little clock over the sink, I heard a low motor hum from outside. Not from the generator shed. From the yard. I set the book down, walked out onto the steps, and stood there in the dark. The smaller dish had moved perhaps 5 degrees since sundown. It was turning with excruciating patience, the drive assembly whispering in short, measured efforts. Along the side of the operations building, a line of dead indicator housings had begun to glow faint amber through dusty plastic. I did what the rules said. I stayed outside the fence. The wind had gone so still I could hear the town below more clearly than usual. A dog barked once. Somewhere, a truck changed gears on the highway. The basin lights looked ordinary at first, but after about a minute I began to notice that more front room windows were lit than I remembered from other nights. Not all of them, Just enough that the town seemed arranged rather than casual, as if people had settled into a shared habit without speaking about it. The small dish completed its turn and stopped. The main dish made a deeper sound, not loud but more structural, like strain moving through metal that had been waiting a long time to be asked anything. It shifted a few degrees west, then north, then held. I remember checking my watch as if that would make the whole thing more comprehensible. I remember smelling hot dust from the machine room vents. I remember noticing, of all things, that a moth had landed on the fence post beside my hand and sat there without moving. The activation lasted 8 minutes. At 10:31, the amber lights in the building winked out one by one. The smaller dish stilled. The main dish settled with a last soft mechanical complaint. The mesa resumed being an abandoned site with a bad roof and too much sky. I slept badly, though not from fear. It was more that my mind kept trying to choose what category the experience belonged to. Hidden backup system, old automated test sequence, capacitor discharge, remote command from somebody at the trust who hadn't bothered telling me the whole truth. The next morning I opened every panel I was allowed to open. Nothing obvious. Battery voltage was ordinary. No fresh heat discoloration. No new logs in the visible control stack. The old supervisory rack, which should have been long dead, showed a faint recent power event on one strip, though it gave no useful origin. By noon, I had a page of notes and no explanation worth respecting. Pete came up in the afternoon. "It moved," I said before he got out of the truck. He nodded. "What time?" I told him. "Over 10:14, he said. "Good." "Good?" "Better." That was all he offered for a moment. Then he opened the truck bed and lifted out a grease gun and a sack of feed store supplies, as if we were discussing weeds. Later, while I helped him patch a loose line cover near the machine room, I asked him whether the town below always looked brighter on rule nights. He glanced down the slope and said, "Most people keep a lamp on." "Why?" "Because that's what they do." "That's not an explanation." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He left me with that. Over the next month, the activations repeated often enough to change the shape of my evenings. Not in a dramatic way, more like weather does. You begin to notice conditions. High, thin cloud from the west, sudden stillness after a windy day, a little extra brightness in town after supper. The church parking lot emptier than usual by 9. Marisol at the diner asking if I needed pie to take with me without looking at the clock. The relay never activated exactly on a schedule, but it had tendencies. Warm nights after sharp daytime cooling. Dry air after a small storm. Sometimes before a weather front arrived, when the stars looked unusually hard and near. It always came at night. It always began with the smaller dish. By then, I had memorized the 6 rules whether I wanted to or not. Most nights, they were just a frame around something strange, but manageable. If the activation started after 10:14, I could remain inside the fence. If both dishes started drifting south together toward town, I was to move to Breaker C and kill the west motor. That happened twice in my first 2 months. The first time I was almost too slow, because I had underestimated how subtle face the town at the same time would look from ground level. The second time I knew what to watch for. The smaller dish would tilt. Then the main dish would begin a slow, ugly correction toward the basin, and the combined angle of them would give me a feeling less of danger than of attention. When I killed the west motor, the main dish shuddered, stalled, and held. The smaller one continued its slow movement alone. Down below, in the town, a few porch lights would come on almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting for that exact cue. I began to understand that the rules did not belong only to the mesa. They belonged to the town, too. It took Marisol to say that plainly. It was a Tuesday in November, cold enough after sunset that the diner windows had started fogging at the edges. I was the last customer, besides 2 county roadmen finishing pie. Marisol was wiping down the pie case. The radio in the kitchen had gone to static because weather was moving in from somewhere past Magdalena. "You all do something different on those nights," I said. She kept wiping the glass for a few seconds. "We all do lots of things different up here. I mean, the relay." She set the rag down. "Pete tell you to ask me?" "No." "Then why ask?" "Because I was living above them. Because every time the dishes moved, the town rearranged its lights in ways no one admitted. Because I was tired of feeling like the only person on the mesa who didn't know whether he was participating in maintenance or ritual." Instead, I said, "Because I'd like to know if the rules are actually for equipment." She looked at me a long moment, then gave a small smile that wasn't amused. "Partly," she said. "You ever seen the town fully dark from up there when it's moving?" "No." "Try not to." That was the first direct answer anybody gave me. After that, I paid closer attention not just to the relay, but to the town. On ordinary nights, San Luis looked like most small desert towns after dark. A porch light here, a television glow there, a kitchen window left bright too long. Then, one by one, the houses settling into themselves. On activation nights, though, the pattern changed. Front rooms lit. Not all night, not every house, but enough. The diner stayed open a little later than it needed to. The water tower beacon, which I'd never cared about before, always seemed conspicuously steady. Once I drove down at dusk and noticed that even the old widow on Calle Norte had set a lamp in her front window, though nobody ever visited her after sundown. No one announced these things. They simply did them. That was what made it eerie in a calm way. Not panic, familiarity. The first real irregularity came in December. It had snowed lightly on the mesa that afternoon, just enough to dust the gravel and collect in the shadowed parts of the dish supports. By evening, the sky had gone clear again, and the cold sharpened everything. Sound carried farther. The town lights looked closer than usual, as if the air between us had been thinned. At 10:07, the smaller dish woke. That was my first early activation. I heard it from the machine room where I had been checking a heater coil. For a second, I assumed I'd misread the clock. Then I looked again. 10:07. Rule 1. If it activates before 10:14, stay outside the fence until the smaller dish completes its first turn. So I went straight out through the side door, locked the fence gate behind me more from habit than necessity, and stood in the cold, with my breath showing, while the dish began its slow movement. The odd part wasn't the early start. It was the town. From the fence line, San Luis looked darker than I expected. Not fully dark, just thin in the wrong places. Whole stretches of Main Street looked dimmer, as if fewer people were awake than should have been on a cold Tuesday. I found myself counting windows without meaning to. Then, midway through the smaller dish's first turn, lights came on. Not everywhere, but quickly, in a visible chain. A porch lamp near the post office, 2 front rooms by the school, the upstairs window over the feed store, the diner sign brightening from dark green to its usual soft red. Someone below had noticed the early start. The smaller dish completed its turn. I went inside the fence and watched the rest of the activation from the machine room door. It lasted 13 minutes. At minute 11, remembering Rule 3, I switched on every interior light in the building. That transformed the place in a way I hadn't expected. The machine room, which was usually a dim, practical cave of conduit and dust, became almost domestic in its brightness. Fluorescents hummed. Old switch labels shone white. The cracked tile in the little side office looked suddenly precise. Outside the open door, the dishes held themselves under the cold stars like pale bones. I remained inside until the motors stopped, just as the rule said. Nothing happened beyond the activation ending normally. Yet afterward, when I shut the lights off again, the dark felt more occupied than before. The next day, I told Pete. He was on the porch of the trailer mending a screen where the wind had torn a corner loose. "Early start and long," I said. "Town dimmed first, then brightened." He nodded. "Marisol call you?" "No. She wouldn't if they saw it themselves." "What exactly is it?" He kept working the screen spline with his thumb, the town going thin. "That doesn't mean anything." "It means enough." He had a gift for answers that were not really answers, and because of the way he gave them, couldn't be dismissed as evasive. He was not enjoying my confusion. He simply believed explanation was less useful than practice. I started spending more time in the old files after that. The operations building still had cabinets of site paperwork. Most of it was dull, in the way all institutional paper is dull. Equipment manifests, asbestos inspections, grounding surveys, monthly lubrication logs, federal asset transfer forms, storm damage notes, outdated maintenance procedures for systems no longer physically present. But mixed into those were older handwritten records from years when the site had still been staffed properly. Night sheets, generator runs, antenna alignments, weather notes. There was no clean account of the activations, not in the way I wanted. No memo saying this is what the relay does now. But there were traces, marginal notes, crossed out instructions, a typed service bulletin from the late 80s with a line underlined in red pencil. South tracking dual alignment not permitted during local occupancy hours. Another from the 90s referencing community light compliance, which I thought at first had to do with municipal visibility ordinances, until I saw it filed with equipment procedures. That was when my thinking changed. Up to then, I had assumed the rules were a local patch over some unexplained technical behavior. After the files, I began to suspect the technical behavior and the town's customs had always been linked. Not folklore built afterward. Built in from the beginning, or close enough. I took that idea down to the diner one windy afternoon and tested it carefully. Marisol was refilling sugar jars. Only 2 truckers were eating. The rest of the room smelled like chile and dish soap, and the sweet pastry glaze they brushed over the pie crusts before baking. "Did the town used to have to help with the relay when it was active?" I asked. She kept pouring sugar. "My father worked up there one summer," she said finally. "Doing what?" "Ground crew. Security mostly. Back when the government still pretended the place had a future." "And?" She looked up, and they asked people to keep lights on. "For calibration?" That's the word they used. Was that all it was? If it had been, nobody would still bother. That was more than she had ever given me before. The snow came and went through December. The sky stayed clear more often than not. On the mesa, winter meant cold mornings, hard stars, and a certain metallic smell in the generator shed when the fuel thickened overnight. I learned to wrap the exposed line near the trailer steps. I learned which windows would rattle in north wind. I learned how silence sounded up there when snow had just dusted the ground and the dishes stood white against white moonlight. And the relay kept activating. Not every week, but often enough that I started marking likely nights on the calendar with small pencil dots, as if anticipation could make me more competent. By January, I could tell when the town was preparing before the first motor hum. A few more lamps than usual. Main Street not emptying too soon. The diner sign steady. Once I saw the school gym lights on well past 9 for no apparent reason, though the parking lot was empty. Another time, every porch on one whole block of Calle Norte had a single low bulb glowing under the eaves. Not bright enough for celebration, just present. It would be easy to say the town was afraid. That isn't how it felt. It felt practiced. There's a difference. Fear is jagged. Practice is smooth. The next thing that changed everything was a phone call. Rule 4 said, if the houses below look darker than usual, call the Junction Diner before touching the controls. Up to then, I had never needed it. The town had always corrected itself, or seemed to. Then, one night in late January, the relay woke at 10:21, and the basin below was wrong at once. Main Street looked thin. Not black, not empty, just underlit, as if a whole section of town had decided independently to go to bed early. The diner sign was on, but 2 blocks south, there was a dark patch where I expected at least half a dozen front windows. The smaller dish began its turn. The main dish made a low preparatory click in its housing. I went straight to the side office phone and called the diner. Marisol answered on the second ring. Junction. It's me, I said. The houses looked darker. She was quiet for perhaps 2 seconds. Then she said, in the same tone she'd used to tell someone the green chili was almost out, we're closing early. And she hung up. That was all. I stood there with the receiver in my hand while the machine room fans began a slow, unnecessary spin behind me. Then, through the office window, I saw lights coming on below. Not frantic. Not all at once, but deliberately. House by house, room by room. Enough of the dark patch lifting that the town recovered its shape before the main dish completed its correction south. I didn't touch the controls. The activation ran 10 minutes and shut down on its own. The next morning I drove into town earlier than usual. The junction was open. Marisol was pouring coffee as if nothing had happened. What does closing early mean? I asked. It means I make some calls. To who? She shrugged. People who are awake. That's not enough people to light a whole neighborhood. It usually is. I sat down at the counter. Why not just tell me what it's supposed to do if the town goes dark? Her hand rested on the coffee pot handle for a moment. Because nobody knows what it's supposed to do, she said. Only what happened when it tried before. That was the first answer that frightened me a little. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was incomplete in the most practical way. What happened before? A week later, I got part of that answer from someone else. There was an older woman in town named Mrs. Werner, who came into the diner most mornings around 10 and sat by the window with half a grapefruit and black coffee. She had taught school in San Luis for decades and still held herself like a person accustomed to being listened to even after retirement. We'd nodded to each other for weeks before she finally asked, without preamble, how the hill was treating me. I said, quiet, mostly. She gave me a long look over the rim of her cup. Mostly. I hesitated, then asked whether she remembered the relay when it was active. Of course, she said. My husband helped pour the concrete pad. Did people really keep lights on for it? She nodded once. At first, because they were asked. And later? She set her spoon down. Later, because one winter, there was an outage in the South End during a test night. That was the story then, or part of it. Not a catastrophe. Not by any newspaper standard. The South End lost power in a storm, while the relay was already running. The backup at the school failed. A handful of streets went dark for maybe 15 minutes. When the power came back, several people later said the same thing in slightly different words. For a short stretch of time, Their own houses had felt unoccupied while they were inside them. Not empty exactly, just wrong. Rooms farther away than they should be. Voices in the next room taking a second too long to answer. One man walked from his kitchen to his back door and came out in the alley without remembering crossing the laundry room. Mrs. Werner's brother, who worked nights then, parked in front of his house and sat in the truck for 20 minutes because every window on his block looked like a photograph of a place nobody lived anymore. No one died, she said, which is why no one outside here ever cared much. But something happened. Yes. And the relay kept moving. She finished her coffee and pushed the cup slightly away, which seemed to indicate the lesson was over. People got practical after that, she said. That's all. Practical. That was the word for San Luis. More than afraid. More than superstitious. Practical. By February, I had become part of that practicality whether I wanted to be or not. My own habits changed. On suspected rule nights, I made sure the machine room switches were free and not sticking. I parked the truck facing the east road rather than the town. I ate at the diner early, so nobody would have to wonder if I was on the mesa or not. I checked the bulb in the side office lamp, because once, on a long activation, I realized how badly I didn't want to be fumbling for a replacement after minute 11. I also stopped carrying my cell phone outside when the smaller dish moved. Rule 5. No radio, no phone, no camera while the relay is moving. Up to then I had respected that because rules are easier to follow when they cost you little. But once, by carelessness, I had left my phone in my shirt pocket during the first few minutes of an activation. When I checked it afterward, the battery was dead from nearly full, and the screen displayed a time from 3 hours earlier. Maybe that was an electrical fluke. I never tested it again. The site itself changed in my perception too. During the day, it was still an abandoned facility with peeling paint and dust in the conduits. At night, on rule nights, it became less abandoned. Not busy. That would be the wrong word. More like it remembered procedure. Lights I didn't use often seemed ready. Panels that meant nothing on ordinary evenings took on a faint logic. The main dish, especially, no longer looked ruined. It looked patient. There was one corner of the machine room where old folding chairs were stacked beside a dead rack cabinet. I have no proof of this, but I came to dislike that corner on long activations. Not because I saw anything there, simply because once the room lights came on after 11 minutes, the chairs always seemed arranged more neatly than I remembered leaving them. That was the sort of detail the job began to accumulate. Nothing theatrical. Just slight adjustments and emphasis. Enough to keep the mind from settling completely. Then spring brought the problem that moved the story from strange routine into something personal. The land trust, after years of dragging its feet, finally got approval to begin partial decommissioning. Not full demolition. The environmental restrictions still prevented that, but they wanted the old power transfer cabinet removed, the smaller dish locked permanently in stow, and most of the remaining control lines cut free, so the site would count as non-operational for insurance purposes. A contractor from Albuquerque was scheduled for May. 2 days' work, maybe 3. Simple, on paper. Pete came up to tell me in person. We stood in the yard with the wind pushing dust around the dish pedestals. "They're serious this time," he said. "What happens if they stow the small dish?" He looked toward town, then back at the fence. "We find out, I suppose." "That doesn't bother you." "It bothers everybody." "Then why not fight it?" "Who's everybody going to fight, exactly?" That was the practical answer again. The town had lived with the relay long enough to build habits around it, but not long enough, or not confidently enough, to claim legal authority over a federal leftover on trust land. If the trust wanted it quiet on paper, paper would likely win. I asked Marisol what people thought. She was slicing pie in the kitchen, the screen door propped open because the evening had turned warm. "Some people think it'll be good," she said. "No more hill nights, no more lamps." "And you?" She set the knife down. "I think people say they want a thing to stop, right up until the week before it would have to stop." "Do you think the rules are actually doing something?" She gave me a patient look. "You live up there. What do you think?" That wasn't fair, but it was honest. I had spent enough nights on the mesa by then to know the rules were not decorative. Whether they constrained a machine, a pattern, or something less easy to name, I didn't know. But they constrained something. The contractor crew arrived the first week of May. There were 3 of them, younger than I expected. Good equipment, clean truck, laminated work orders. The light, cheerful cynicism of people who spend a lot of time removing older people's solutions. Their lead was a man named Darren, who kept calling the relay the dish farm, and had the irritating habit of explaining simple electrical steps to me in a voice normally reserved for relatives. They were there to remove the transfer cabinet first, then isolate the west motor line permanently, then secure the smaller dish. I told Darren there were local procedures for nights when the site came active. He smiled as though humoring a caretaker who had gone a little native. "This place doesn't come active," he said. "It leaks residual charge through bad legacy control." "Whatever you want to call it," I said. "I'd prefer you not cut the west motor until after you've seen a cycle." He checked his paperwork. "We'll be done before dark." That, I think, was the moment I began deciding that if the night went bad, I would trust the town over the paperwork. The first day went smoothly enough. They cleared brush around the transfer shed, tagged lines, and spent half an afternoon arguing with rusted bolts. Darren talked too much. One of the younger men kept taking photos for the work file until I told him, more sharply than I intended, not to use the camera after sundown if the dishes started moving. He laughed and said, "Ghost rules?" I didn't answer. The second day, weather changed. A line of monsoon buildup came from the southwest, much earlier in the season than usual. The sky went hard and yellow by 4 in the afternoon. Heat sat low over the basin. Even the town looked hushed from above, as if waiting for the first wind. By 6, the contractor crew had decided to stay in town rather than drive back to Albuquerque in storm conditions. They checked into the little motel by the highway and said they'd finish the west motor line in the morning. I was relieved. Then, just after 9, a transformer somewhere below town blew. I saw the flash from the trailer window and heard the delay of it a second later. Half of San Luis went dark at once. Not all of it, but enough. Main Street survived on a few scattered lights and the diner sign. The south blocks, though, went almost completely black. I got in the truck and drove down immediately. The junction was running on a little gas generator Pete had apparently kept ready for years. The sign outside was dimmer than usual, but lit. Inside, the room smelled of coffee, hot wiring, and the anxious stillness of people who were trying not to alarm each other. Marisol was at the counter. Pete sat in the back booth. 2 linemen from the county utility were on the phone near the pie case. "Substation?" I asked. Pete nodded. "South feeder. They're trying to reroute." "How long?" He gave a tired little shrug. "Long enough to matter if the hill wakes." There it was, plain at last. No more pretending the relay was my problem alone. I looked at the clock over the register. 9:41. "If it starts," Marisol said, "call before you touch anything." I know Rule 4. "This isn't that," she said. "If it starts tonight, don't wait to see if the block comes back." I understood what she meant, even though she didn't say it directly. If the town stayed too dark, the rules would stop being enough. I drove back up with the sky flickering far off over the ridges and the first warm gusts of storm wind hitting the mesa. The contractor's tools lay stacked by the transfer shed where they had left them. The dishes stood pale against the bruised clouds. Down below, the dark section of town remained dark. The smaller dish woke at 9:58. Early. Rule 1 put me outside the fence. I stood there with the chain link cold under one hand and watched the smaller dish begin its first turn under lightning far to the south. The town looked wrong at once. Not just dim, broken into islands of occupancy with too much black between them. The diner sign, a few porch lights, one upstairs bedroom by the school, then long patches of nothing. I called the junction from the trailer phone. Marisol answered immediately, as if she had been holding the receiver. "It started," I said. "I know. Still dark?" "South side, yes. Utilities working." She hesitated. "We're lighting what we can." Below us, as if to confirm it, 2 more houses came on. Then a church side window. Then the gas station canopy lights flared weakly and died again. The smaller dish completed its first turn. I went inside the fence. The main dish engaged almost at once, deeper and more insistent than usual. It began to correct south. The smaller dish, instead of holding, kept moving. Both dishes facing the town. I ran to breaker C and killed the west motor. The main dish shuddered and stalled. The smaller one continued tracking alone. Rule 2 observed. For the moment. The storm wind freshened. Dust hit the side of the building in dry sheets before the rain ever arrived. Somewhere behind me, a loose contractor tarp snapped against pipe. Down below, the dark patch in town still hadn't filled. At minute 5, the main dish tried to move again, despite the open breaker. That had never happened before. Not fully. Just a stiff, insect-like attempt in the drive housing. A strain traveling through metal that should have been electrically denied. I remember putting my palm against the warm breaker box and feeling a vibration in it, like a second pulse. Minute 7. The town dimmed further. Not because more power failed, I think. Because the storm reached it. Dust, or rain, or simple distance took the remaining weak lights and flattened them. From the mesa, San Luis began losing definition. The streets I knew separated less cleanly. The basin itself looked shallower. Rule 6 rose in my mind with sudden clarity. If the town appears completely dark, leave by the east road, and do not drive through Main Street until sunrise. That was the instruction. If the town went fully dark, I was meant to leave. Not save the site. Not save the town. Leave. I got as far as the truck before I stopped. Not out of bravery, out of arithmetic. If I left, the relay would continue active behind me. The town below was partly dark, storm-struck, and full of people who had built their own habits around the hill. Marisol was in the diner. Pete, too. Mrs. Werner. The children in the teacher housing. Whoever had remembered to light front rooms, and whoever had not. Rule 6 might have been written to preserve one person from whatever happened next. It did not promise anything for the people staying below. The machine room clock hit minute 11. Rule 3. If activation continues past that, switch on every interior light and remain inside until the motors stop. For months, I had treated that rule as a late-stage safety procedure, something about visibility or grounding or controlled load. In that moment, looking from the truck toward the litless town and back toward the dark machine room, I understood it differently. If the town could not hold occupancy, the station had to. I ran back inside. Every switch, every fluorescent. The office lamp, the machine room strip lights, the side hall bulbs I never used, even the bad exterior work light over the south door. The building flared alive against the storm-dark mesa, bright as it had probably not been in years. Then I stayed. That part matters. The rule didn't say to light the building and go. It said, remain inside until the motors stop. So I remained. I stood first, then sat. Because standing felt theatrical, and I needed calm more than posture. There was an old metal chair beside the dead rack cabinet. I pulled it into the center of the machine room, where the light was strongest, and sat facing the open interior doorway. Not hiding. Not really performing either. Just being plainly there. Outside, the smaller dish completed a slow, ugly correction. The main dish, against the killed breaker, gave a long, low strain, and then settled. For a moment, the whole site hummed, as if some buried part of it had finally found the load it wanted. Nothing rushed at the windows. No voice came over the dead racks. The horror, if that's the word, was subtler and calmer than that. It was in the feeling that the building had become legible to something outside it by the simple fact of being brightly inhabited. The room felt organized around my presence in a way ordinary rooms do not. The fluorescent hum sharpened. Rain finally began, hard and sudden, hammering the steel roof in dense sheets. Through the office window, the town below vanished almost completely behind weather. I sat in the chair and kept my hands flat on my thighs to stop them shaking. At some point, I don't know when exactly because I did not look at the clock again, I noticed the folding chairs in the corner. There had been 4 stacked there earlier. Now there were 5. That is the one detail I still cannot place anywhere reasonable. Maybe one had been hidden behind the rack, and the changed shadows brought it out. Maybe stress does patient things to depth perception. I have no proof of anything except my own dislike of that corner afterward. The activation continued. 12 minutes. 13. 14. Longer than any I had seen. The dishes outside made only small adjustments now. Slow, reluctant, almost satisfied. Then, far below, the town lights came back. Not all in a blaze. More like a quilt being restitched. The gas station canopy. 3 blocks on the south side. The school. A porch. Then another. Then the diner sign, suddenly strong and red through the rain. The hum in the machine room changed at once. Not louder. Less intimate. The main dish gave one final correction, north this time, and stopped fighting the killed breaker. The smaller dish eased back by degrees. At last, with almost embarrassing ordinariness, the amber lights in the old racks went out one after another. The site powered down. I remained in the chair for another minute because the rule said to stay until the motor stopped, not until I felt better. When I finally stood, the room looked only like a room again. Fluorescence, dust, old labels, bad tile, the ordinary indignity of abandoned equipment. In the corner, the folding chairs were 4, after all. I shut off the lights, one by one. The storm moved east before midnight. Rainwater ran down the gravel and into the culvert line. The town below held its shape. I drove down around 1 in the morning. The junction was still open. Not for business anymore, just for whoever needed to sit somewhere lit and dry. Marisol was behind the counter with her sleeves rolled up. Pete sat with a mug between both hands. One of the utility men was half asleep in a booth. When I came in, nobody asked what had happened first. Marisol just looked at me and said, "You stayed." I nodded. She poured coffee without asking whether I wanted it. Pete watched the steam rise from my cup for a while before he said, "That was the right choice." Rule 6 said leave. Rule 6 assumes the town can't be held. And if it can, then the hill takes the work. That was the closest anybody ever came to explaining Rule 3. The contractor crew finished the paperwork the next day, And then, after hearing enough from Pete, the utility men and me to unsettle them properly, decided to postpone cutting the west motor line until the trust could review things. Darren acted as if the decision was entirely about storm damage and safety, which was fine with me. Men like him prefer backing away from mysteries by renaming them liability. 2 weeks later, the trust sent an engineer out from Santa Fe. He was older, quieter, and more willing to listen than the crew had been. I showed him the breaker strain marks, the anomalous draw on the isolated line, the weather notes, the long-run timings, everything I had written. I did not tell him about the fifth chair. I did tell him, carefully, that the site behaved as though certain partial systems still coordinated under conditions not captured by the surviving plants, and that removing one dish without understanding the remaining interactions might shift rather than eliminate the activation behavior. That language, dry as it was, bought time. The trust decided against partial decommissioning that summer. Officially, they cited uncertain system condition, weather exposure, and the cost-benefit mismatch of doing work twice if full demolition later became possible. Unofficially, I think they recognized the oldest truth in infrastructure management, which is that there are problems you do not improve by touching them halfway. I stayed another 18 months. The activations continued, though never quite as badly as that storm night. The town kept its lamps. I kept the site. The rules remained 6. Pete stopped coming up regularly after that. His knees bothered him more, and I think he felt the hill had passed properly into my care. Marisol and I never became what people might imagine from a story told late at night. We ate pie after closing more than once. We talked in the diner kitchen while the last pot soaked. We spent one long Sunday walking the dry wash after a rain and saying mostly simple things. That was enough. Sometimes, enough is the durable version. Summer on the mesa was hot, resinous, and full of grasshoppers flinging themselves against the building. Autumn brought the cleanest skies. Winter brought the rule nights people respected most. Over time, I became less interested in explanation and more interested in continuity. Oil the drives, check the switches, replace bulbs before they fail. Know which porch in town usually lights first. Keep the east road clear after rain. Practical things. That may sound like surrender. It wasn't. It was citizenship of a kind. I finally left because my mother got sick in Oklahoma, and there are moments when the self you have become in one landscape has to yield to the older self other people still need. The trust hired a younger man from Las Cruces to take the site. I trained him for 2 weeks. I showed him the generator and the roof sealant and the pack rat habits. On the last day, I opened the drawer in the control room desk and handed him the plastic sleeve with the 6 rules inside. He read them, frowned, and looked up. "What are these for?" I heard Pete's answer come back through me, almost exactly. "For when it activates," I said. I did tell him one extra thing. "Don't wait too long to trust the town," I said. "They've been doing their part longer than you'll think." He nodded politely in the way people do when they mean to remember the practical, but not yet the deeper part. I went east that October. My mother lasted another year, then less, then not at all. Life folded into appointments, pharmacies, winter roads, and the quiet labor of being a son again. After that, I took other work, better paying work mostly, indoor work for a while, then field contracts again, but never another place quite like the Mesa. Every now and then, usually in late winter, or right after a storm, I'd call the junction. Marisol would answer, or Pete if he was helping. We'd talk about ordinary things first. The school roof, who sold their place up on County Road 8, whether the summer had been too dry. Then, if the conversation made room for it, One of us might say, "How's the hill?" And the other would answer, "Still minded," or "Quiet this month," or once, memorably, "Long one last Tuesday." But the town held. That was enough. About 7 years after I left, a large envelope arrived with no note inside. The return address was the Land Trust office. In the envelope was a folded copy of an old regional communications map, the kind drawn before satellite systems learned to hide their bodies better. Relay sites, repeater points, tracking stations, uplink pads. Most were crossed out in red pencil as decommissioned or gone. 4 were circled in blue. San Luis was one of them. The others were in Nevada, West Texas, and a part of eastern Oregon I'd only driven through once. Tucked into the map was a newer photocopy of the rules sheet from the Mesa. Still 6 rules. But typed at the bottom, in fresher lettering, was one added line. If town power is lost during activation, the station may be used as the primary occupied point until local lights return. That wasn't new in substance, only in honesty. I sat at my kitchen table with that map for a long time.